So last week we finished up talking about how Nebuchadnezzar had this dream of this golden image, and Daniel comes in and interprets the dream. And what I love about Daniel is that Daniel was not a self-promoter. He didn't care whether he had influence with the king. He didn't care whether the king knew his name or any of that. Actually, his gift made room for him. And that's what the Bible says will happen. The Bible tells us that your gift will make room for you. You don't have to make room for your gift. Your gift will make room for you, meaning that if you steward that gift and you're diligent with it, then God will open those doors for your gift to come in and be a blessing to people. And that's what we see with Daniel throughout the book. So in a sense, through Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar encounters God, and it changes him. It changes the way that he thinks, and it changes the way that he lives, but it's not really lasting. I mean, he definitely experienced God, but it wasn't something that lasted throughout the rest of his kingship. So right away in Daniel chapter 3, which is what we're going to look at tonight, you kind of see that even though he had this encounter with God, he's still full of himself. So we're going to pick up tonight there in verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, most scholars believe that this was the image in his dream. So he has this dream of this golden image. Daniel tells him what it is. He has this brilliant idea to actually build the image that he saw. Now, that's not 100% confirmed, but most scholars believe that this is the image that he set up. He gathers all the land together to dedicate it, and then in verse 4, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." So you can see really clearly that there's not a lot of freedom of religion in King Nebuchadnezzar's court here. That this is a forced worship of a golden image, and if not, you will be burned to death. That is the way things roll here in Babylon. So Daniel, of course, and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this is where they live. Well, this is a huge problem for them because they worship God, and they're not going to bow down to any image. They're not going to worship any false gods. And so this is a big problem for them. Now you have to remember, because you need a little context and a little awareness of what was going on here. You have to remember that Babylon was one of the biggest and greatest empires in world history. And there's so much arrogance and pride that goes along with that because Nebuchadnezzar was a huge part of that. And so the city of Babylon was actually about 200 square miles. And it was surrounded by thick walls, so thick that they had chariot races on the top of the walls. They were just enormous. So this is roughly about the size of Chicago, modern day Chicago. So this is an enormous, city, an enormous place. And it wasn't just that Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. As being the king of Babylon, he was almost effectively the king of the world because he was the most powerful nation and empire in the world at that time. Now you also have to remember that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they have already gained some influence with King Nebuchadnezzar because Daniel interpreted his dream when all the other magicians and advisors and everyone else couldn't. So there's a little bit of jealousy that comes along with that because here these guys are, they're outsiders, they're Hebrews, they're not one of us, they're slaves that have been exiled in, and now they have all this favor with King Nebuchadnezzar. So because of that jealousy, there's a plot that is hatched against them. Some of the other advisors and the magicians and guys, they see this as an opportunity to cause problems between Daniel and the other Hebrews and King Nebuchadnezzar. And so we see that in verse 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace." There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So make no mistake about it, these guys that are accusing the Hebrews, they could care less about the golden image. They don't care whether that golden image is worshiped. That makes no difference to them. They don't care about loyalty or authority to the king. This is about one thing. This is about jealousy. This is about jealousy of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the position that they have started to gain with the king. And so it's the typical workplace politics that you see, except it's in place where someone can burn you alive when you don't follow orders. So it's a little bit more, the stakes are a little bit higher. But that's what's going on. This is a jealous, very jealous person or group of people, and they're coming against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But it works. They lit a fire under Nebuchadnezzar. When he heard that, he's very offended. Verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" So you can see, you can taste the arrogance that is coming out of his mouth when he says that. He's saying, basically what he's saying is, I am the most powerful man in the world, and you are a worthless nobody. You are a cockroach to me that I could crush at a moment's notice. And who is this God that you serve that is going to deliver you out of my hands? So he had no confidence that their God or anybody, because that's what he was used to. He was used to saying, doing whatever he wanted, and those orders were executed, but he had never encountered the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. My other question is, I wonder if in reality, every time that they mentioned this image, that they actually listed out all 14 of these instruments, the lyre, the pipe, the bagpipe, the horn, I don't know if they just went on and on every single time. Sir, the bagpipe, the horn, the lyre, the trigon, it's being played and they're not bowing down. But I love Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's answer. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." So these guys were bold. Now, I want to point out a few things, because what we've been talking about is how to live godly in an ungodly culture. And what we have to go through, in our current culture as Americans living in this country, a country that's changing, a country that is not following God the way that we once were, and values are changing, norms are changing. So how do we live godly in an ungodly culture? Well, looking to their example, I want to point out a few things, because obviously this is an extreme case for them, and they had it much harder than we'll ever have it. The first thing I want you to notice is that these guys were completely free from the fear of man. They were not afraid of man, and that it didn't matter whether that was a coworker or another Hebrew or another, magician or advisor, or whether it was the king of Babylon himself, Nebuchadnezzar. It didn't matter. They were free from the fear of man. They had gotten totally free from worrying about the consequences that could be imposed on them by someone else. And I think this is a huge lesson for us. If we're going to live godly in an ungodly culture, then we're going to have to be free from the fear of man. We're going to have to be free from worrying about consequences that can be imposed on us by ungodly people. We're going to have to be free from other people's opinions not being as popular, not looked at as wise or cutting edge or what all the things that come along with living godly. At a certain point, you have to be totally free from that. And you have to only care about what one person thinks about you, and that is God. Instead of being a man pleaser, we have to be a God pleaser. And you see this in the way that they answered King Nebuchadnezzar. Now remember, King Nebuchadnezzar was in a rage. All right, when he heard that these guys were not obeying his order that he gave, he was furious. He was in a rage, the kind of rage that the most powerful man in the world gets into when your slave is not impressed by you. So he's upset, okay? And this is what they said to him. And I think you can even see the respect and that they try to honor him, but at the same time, they're more fearful and honoring of God than they are of King Nebuchadnezzar. They said, "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." In other words, we're not going to defend ourselves. I mean, we're not going to try to work up an explanation for this. We're not going to try to weasel out of this. We're not going to try to deny it. We're not going to try to hide it. We're not going to try to give you a reason why we're doing it. We don't have a reason to answer you in this matter. If this is the case, what you're saying, then our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace that you're threatening us with. And he will deliver us out of your hand. It's short, it's sweet, it's to the point, it's bold, and it's not fake. They meant it. I believe these men had already counted their lives as lost. I believe they had already counted themselves willing to die for their faith. And that you could tell there's no fear in them. They're not afraid of the fiery furnace. And one reason they're not afraid is because they trust their God. And they've already decided that we are not going to compromise no matter what, even if it means being burned alive. So if we're going to live godly in an ungodly culture, the first thing that we have to do is we have to be free from the opinions of man. We have to be free from pleasing people. The second thing is that we have to trust God. Now, you can see real quickly, this is an overused phrase in the church. Trust God, believe God. You just hear it so much. But you can see real quick that what they had is different than what a lot of people have. A lot of people say they trust God and say they believe God, but if your life is on the line, this is a whole different kind of trust, a whole different kind of faith that you see here. And again, we see this in verse 17, this confidence. It goes, if this is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand. So they have complete confidence that God is going to deliver them. And for them, this was not some witty phrase that they heard in a sermon that they're like tweeting or posting on Facebook and everybody's liking it. This is something they were living out on a daily basis through extreme trial and difficulty. They were living this out, trusting God every single day that he was with them, to protect them, to guard them, to keep them, to preserve them. They were dependent on God to protect them in this very difficult time. So they had grown in their faith to this point of where they were at. Now for us, I want to ask you, in our context, many of us work in places where it's difficult to live by our convictions and live by our standards. You know, there are jobs we take that require us to sometimes do things or say things that go against our convictions, that require us to be out of church constantly, to miss church, hurts our relationship with the Lord. Are we at that place, are you at that place where you trust God enough to say, I'm going to live right and do what's right, and I'm going to trust that God's going to take care of me? In other words, I'm going to live by my convictions as a Christian. And that may, in the short term, have consequences. But I'm believing God and trusting God that he's big enough to take care of me and to protect me. Now, that seems almost petty when you compare it to what they were having to believe God about. They weren't having to believe God that, oh, I'm going to make less money, or I'm not going to get that promotion, or whatever. Their choices could have ended in them being burned to death. Your choices could lead to you not having the pay raise, or not getting the job, or not getting the promotion, or worst case, being fired. Okay, but you're not going to be burned alive. But they believed God that he was big enough to take care of them when they made the right decision. And all I want to challenge you with tonight is, as a Christian, when you have convictions in your heart, are you bold enough? Do you trust God enough to stand up to supervisors, employees, situations in your life and say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that because it violates my conscience, it violates my faith, it violates my heart? Do you have the boldness and the conviction and the faith that God will take care of you to be able to do that? The third thing I see in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as far as living godly in an ungodly culture is an unwillingness to compromise and a willingness to live with the consequences that come with not compromising, if that makes sense. So what I'm saying is they were unwilling to compromise, not compromising. They were solid in that. But then you also see this willingness too, that because I'm uncompromising, I'm willing to live with the consequences that may come along with that. See, some people don't want to compromise, and then they get mad when there's consequences about it. Well, you're just targeting me because I'm a Christian. You're complaining about the consequences that come along with having to stand up for your faith. That's not what you see here. They were unwilling to compromise, but there was also a willingness that, yeah, there may be consequences because I'm doing this, and I'm okay with that. So in verse 17, they just finished saying, we believe our God will deliver us. We know He's able. He will deliver us. But then in verse 18, but if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So what are they saying? They're saying, listen, we're trusting God to deliver us. But even if He doesn't, don't think that we are going to bow or that we are going to submit to this. In other words, we are willing to deal with whatever consequences this brings on our life. And I'm going to say that in America, we're not used to that. We are not used to it. We are used to being protected, having freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and all of those things, and we're used to being protected, by these things. But there may come a time, and the nation is changing, there may come a time where we have to experience a few consequences for living by our convictions and living by our faith. So when we're talking about living godly in an ungodly culture, we need to start asking ourselves that question as believers. Are you okay with doing right and pleasing God, even if it means some consequences coming on your life, your family, your job, your money and finances? Because for all over the world, living for God is costly for people. It's very costly, all the way up to their lives. So this is a relatively foreign thing that we have here in America to the concept of what a Christian is to be able to live free and blessed and unpersecuted as a believer. Most places in the world throughout history, there's been extreme persecution on believers. We are blessed here in the United States to be able to worship God freely. But as our culture changes and as the nation changes, are we okay with experiencing consequences of living right? Because I can tell you that many are not. And many, when the pressure gets turned up and the consequences start getting more intense and more strict, you're going to see people that fall away. You're going to see people that compromise because of the consequences. And what we see here from these guys is that even unto death, they were willing to experience consequences in order to be faithful to God. So they were willing to experience those consequences, but the end of the story, praise God, they did not have to experience the consequences because they were correct. Their God did come through for them. In verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury because, again, these guys are not respecting him. This is not the reaction he thought he was going to get. He was expecting to see people begging for their life, shaking in their boots, pleading for mercy from great King Nebuchadnezzar. That's not what he got. He got this wise, confident, faith-filled answer, and it's blown his, and all it did was make him more mad. So Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. The expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. So you could see he's just in a crazy rage at this point. He ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, cast them into the burning fiery furnace. These men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, their garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said, "True, King." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Praise God. So he throws them in, and he looks. When he starts looking into the fiery furnace, he can see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But then he says there's a 4th figure walking around in there. And I can tell you, when they were walking around in there, it's not just that they were walking around that shocked him. It was the whole demeanor of them in there. They're not on fire. They're not burning in pain. They're not screaming for their life. They're walking around in there like a stroll in the park. Maybe they're praising God. I don't know what they're doing, but he could tell by the way they were acting, this isn't normal. Something's up here. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach." He's talking to men that are burning on fire. So he thinks, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God." So they were miraculously delivered and preserved. And you need to know and understand that this is the same God that you serve. And when we are loyal to him and devoted to him and committed to him in the midst of an ungodly culture, it honors God and it opens the door for tremendous miracles, and it opens the door for God to come in and move on our behalf. But when we cower down and we're afraid because of consequences and repercussions, then we close that door shut. And I'm believing for One Life to be a church filled with people that are not afraid of consequences, not afraid of what man can do to us, but we are more concerned with pleasing God and what he can do, just like we see in the book of Daniel chapter 3.